Us Americans have many responsibilities, civic responsibilities. Every 4 years, we vote for our next president. This got me wondering about the civil rights movement and everything that led to it, starting in the Civil War. Of course, we know that before the Civil War era, that African Americans were not even considered citizens and were slaves. During this era, African Americans, of course, had no voting rights. But now, let's skip to the Civil War era. Confederacy had been defeated and granted African American citizenship through the 13th Amendment. Well, obviously, they were still oppressed, and of course, only men can vote. But Abraham Lincoln was the main man trying to get slavery abolished. After his untimely demise, Andrew Jackson came to succession. He, unlike Lincoln, was tolerant and more lenient for the South, who then made black codes. These black codes, or better known as Jim Crow laws, enforced segregation throughout the South. The beginning of these laws passed in 1877, which moreover enforced white supremacy. African Americans then went through legal routes for their rights, which of course didn't lead to success as many would think. Now that the Civil War is over, African Americans have civil rights, right? Well, this would soon be a huge uphill battle. This era would actually be a period of unequal energy towards African Americans that had second-class citizenship in most parts of America at the time. Due to African Americans wanting to be seen as equal citizens, they rebelled against racial discrimination with many marches, freedom rides, boycotts, and much more. These rallies and rebellion gained a lot of attention to Americans all over. These rallies were soon getting attention in radios, newspaper, television reports, and cameramen who filmed and documented this struggle of racial discrimination. Because of the success of these printed and filmed materials, the Brown decision in 1954 favored towards African Americans and aided in future anti-discriminatory acts. I can say that most Americans know who Rosa Parks is and what she did for the civil rights movement, but she is a major component for the movement and what would soon come out of it. Rosa Parks famously refused to get up from her seat for a white man who legally had the seat for taking. Because of this act, she was promptly arrested. Her arrest was then sparked with uproar and outrage, with many citing for support in Rosa. She was named the mother of modern-day civil rights movement. Because of her, leaders of the community founded the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, with one of the leaders being Martin Luther King Jr. Because of this, it also placed him front and center for a civil rights movement. Let's move a little forward now. In 1957, the Civil Rights Act was also going to be enacted. At this time, all Americans could vote, but many South states made it harder for African Americans to vote. Most made black voters do a literacy test, which was very confusing, misleading, and basically impossible to pass. Soon, Eisenhower administration pressed Congress and made them rethink newer civil rights legislation. And then, on September 9th, 1957, he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and made it into law. It made federal prosecution to anyone who tried to prevent anyone from voting. This act also made a commission to investigate in fraud. During this time in 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. famously ended segregation in buses in Montgomery, Alabama. Now that we're on Martin once again, let's go into the biggest leader of civil rights. Martin Luther was the most prominent and influential leader of the civil rights movement in America. When you think about civil rights, many think about him and his famous "I've had a dream" speech. Martin Luther was born January 15, 1929, and assassinated in 1968. Martin Luther was a civil rights activist during the mid-1950s. Martin got ideas from Gandhi, and over 11 years, 1957 through 1968, had traveled 6 million miles and had spoken 25,000 times. These speeches and these millions of miles made him the leading man he was. By 1954, he was executive committee of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. Martin and his group did many boycotts, peaceful protests, and speeches, his famous "I've Had a Dream" speech being one of them. This speech was said on March in Washington, which was given to thousands of listeners. Martin Luther used many peaceful protests for social change, which were all philosophies of nonviolence. On April 4th, 1968, Martin was assassinated while on his Memphis balcony before he held a protest. Because of what he did and his inspiration on many African Americans, he was seen as the biggest leaderhead of the topic of civil rights in America and is responsible for many rights African Americans have today. Now that it's the 60s and many civil rights protests are breaking down many walls that African Americans could never dream to be true, what else do we do now? The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was signed and granted commission with greater authority. Even though we think of African Americans when we think of the civil rights movement, many other races were still being negatively impacted by the lack of civil rights. Many Hispanics faced mass deportation even if they were legal, and educational segregation in Southwest schools along with police brutality. During this time, because of women's rights movement, it granted many new civil rights with the Equal Pay Act of 1963 that made pay equal no matter gender, which broke down barriers for women in the workforce. Let's go back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This act prohibited schemes to limit voting, gave racial and religious minorities equal access to public spaces or accommodations, and outlawed job discrimination based on race, gender, color, and religion. We can thank many people in the civil rights movement for our modern society in America and how far we came as a society. Because of amazing civil rights leaders, we can thank many people in the civil rights movement for our modern society in America and how far we came as a society. I can proudly say that without the civil rights movement, that we would have been in a totally different society today. Because of these powerful and outspoken leaders, we are what we are in America.